back to my channel. Today I'm showing you how to feed your sourdough starter. Let's get to it. This isn't just any sourdough starter feeding tutorial. Mine uses a 2-to-1 ratio to have a very strong active starter. Your starter will be the consistency of a really thick pancake batter, which will hold up really well when you're trying to bake bread, scones, anything that has a lot of moisture. It's a really well-rounded starter. Let's start feeding it. To get started, we are going to need filtered water. You never want to use water from the kitchen sink, especially if you live in town or the city. The water, when it's treated, has chemicals and that can kill the active cultures in your starter. You will also want to use unbleached all-purpose flour. A lot of people use bleached. It's been a controversial topic. I think unbleached is better. It makes a stronger starter, which is what you want. But if you can't find or if you don't want to use unbleached, then bleached is fine. One of the biggest questions everyone asks me is, how much do I feed my starter? This right here is about, I think it's a gallon. I think it's a gallon container, which means I usually keep around half of a gallon of starter. I used to have a smaller one that was only 16 ounces. But for this, I usually feed it 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of water, and that is perfect. So for the 2-to-1 ratio, it's 2 parts flour, 1 part water. So if you have a 16-ounce jar, which is usually the smallest I would go or recommend to go, you're gonna do like half of a cup of flour, 1/4 of a cup of water. Now, everybody wonders, how do I know how much to feed my starter using this 2-to-1 ratio? This is something that a lot of people get hung up on, and please don't, it's not that complicated. Instead, what I do, I just look to see how much starter I have in here. So you always want to feed your starter so that it's only halfway full. That way, whenever it ferments and the cultures are all active, it has room to rise and it's not gonna go out all over your countertop or wherever you store your starter. So for me, I just kind of eyeball it and do the 2 cups flour, 1 cup water, but you just want to make it at least like no more than halfway full. Before we feed it, I don't know if you can all see, let me bring it up here. So can you see how it's a little watery and there's like grayish stuff on top? That is not mold. That is actually something called hooch, and it smells like alcohol. It just means that your starter is really hungry, and it's basically, that's all it's really telling you. It's not mold, it's not your starter going bad, it's just hungry. You can either just stir that in or pour it off. I usually just stir it in unless it's super dark. If your starter ever smells like mold or it's pink or really dark black, those are signs of molding and you might want to toss it out, but please don't toss your starter if it's gray. That is okay. To get started, we're going to start out with our 2 cups of flour or whatever measurements you use. So if you have a 16 to 20 ounce container, I would do half of a cup of flour, 1/4 of a cup of water. If you have anything larger, you can just kind of eyeball it and do like 1 cup of flour, half of a cup of water. Just note that if you have a lot of starter and it's already half full and you don't have room to feed it, you can do 2 things. The first thing is you can either feed it like 2 tablespoons of flour, 1 tablespoon of water, depending on how large your starter is. That would not work for this. It would eat it up way too fast, but if you have a small starter, that would work. The other thing that you can do is you can discard some of your starter. So say your starter doesn't have any room to rise, but if you really had to, you could still feed it if it was 3/4. Otherwise, the second way that I would do it is I would take out half of a cup to a cup of starter and use that as a discard. So you can use that in any recipe that's not needing a rise. So not cinnamon rolls, not breads, not baked like treats that need to rise up. But anything with a discard that doesn't need to rise, you can use that. Just know, a normal starter, as long as you have plenty of room, you do not need to discard before you start feeding your starter. That is a huge misconception in the sourdough world, and so yeah, you do not need to discard any starter unless you need the room. So all I did was I store my sourdough starter in the refrigerator, and I'll feed it like 2 to 3 times a week. I'll get it out and use it. You can leave it in there for a week, week and a half before you feed it. But I just got mine out of the fridge. I took the top off. Now we'll get started feeding it. So we're gonna add in 2 cups of flour, at least to mine. So that's 2 cups. And then we're gonna do 1 cup of filtered water. Just pour that in. Again, that's the 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts flour, 1 part water. And then you can use a spoon, you can use, that's either wooden or metal, you can use a spatula. I like to use a spatula, it's just a lot easier to scrape the sides. But you're just gonna go in here and you're gonna stir everything up. What I like to do, I just stir in the hooch, I stir in everything, and it's going to be very thick. If you ever can't stir it to combine it, you can add a little more water in. You don't have to do the exact measurements. More than anything, you're just looking for a thick consistency. So like this is a little too thick, I'm gonna add in a little more water. A lot of people like to say that you have to be exact. You don't. I usually don't measure when I feed my starter, but sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It's really okay. You're just looking for that consistency. All right, so after you get this stirred up, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your spoon or spatula and you're gonna scrape down the sides. That's just to kind of clean everything up and make sure everything's on the bottom. You're not gonna get it completely clean. That is perfectly fine. Your starter actually thrives in a messy environment. So if you are cleaning your jar and taking your starter out and transferring it from one jar to the next every week, please be careful. That is going to weaken your starter. I have not changed my jar except for one time over the last 2 years when I moved it into this big container to make more. So just know, like, your starter jar does not need cleaned unless you really want to. But even then, I probably would only clean it once a quarter, so once every 3 months. If you really wanted to, you could take it out and put it in a different jar every 3 months and clean it, but that is super unnecessary. You do not need to do that. Once your starter is completely stirred together and scraped down, you are finished. You can take a rag that's wet, make sure it has filtered water on it, not sink water, and you can wipe off the outside of your glass if you would like to. Otherwise, it's ready to go. It looks messy, but it's completely fine. But I do want to show you the consistency we're looking for. Like I said earlier, it's a very thick pancake batter, and that is what that's what you want. So if you can see this, that is what you're looking for. Let me show you. To finish up, we are going to put the lid on. Now, never, ever, ever put on an airtight lid. Your starter, when it's fermenting, can explode, and that would be terrifying and really bad for anybody in the area. So, like, you can use just a cloth covering. I like to use, it came with this metal lid. This is like a big mason jar. What I do is I put it on and I turn it once. That's it. It just covers it. It allows air to come in and out. So that's what I would do if I was you. So just put your lid on, turn it once, and that's it. And then you can store this in the refrigerator or on the counter, depending on how often you're going to use it. If you store it on the counter, you need to do this feeding every 12 to 24 hours. If you store it in the refrigerator, you can feed it only once a week or once every 8 days. If you store it in the fridge, you can take it out and use it as much as you want. It just slows the fermentation down so you're not feeding it all the time. I store mine in the refrigerator, so I'll take it out, and if it's a recipe like pancakes that I don't need to rise, I will use it cold. If I need it to rise, something like a bread recipe, what I'll do is I take it out of the fridge 4 to 12 hours before I need it. I will feed it again. Yes, you will feed it before you put it in the fridge and then right when you get it out. So I get it out of the fridge 4 to 12 hours before. I'll feed it the 2-to-1 ratio and let it sit on the counter for 4 hours. You always want to wait 4 to 12 hours before using your fed starter in your recipes to make sure it has time to actively ferment and get ready for you to rise everything. Thank you for joining me today on this tutorial on how to feed your sourdough starter. There are tons and tons and tons of resources and guides on my blog, Plum Branch Home. You can find all those links below. I have an entire section dedicated to Sourdough Explained, Sourdough 101, Sourdough for Beginners. So go check that out if you're interested or need more help. You can always email me at molly@plumbranchhome, and I'm always here to help you. Until next time, happy sourdough baking.